he couldn't wait. I think he invited you on just so he could say this. Go on, say it again, Matthew.
You mean there's no such thing as muscle memory?
No.
No. You are listening to the Game Like Training Radio podcast, where we talk about the PGA Tour, junior golf, college golf, golf practice, golf learning, and golf psychology. On this show, we're going to be sharing our thoughts, our beliefs that have really come from over a decade of being in the industry. And not only that, but we'll be talking to industry leaders, world-renowned academics, and pioneering professors to bring you the most up-to-date information and evidence-based strategies to improve your game or your golf coaching. Hey, I'm one of your hosts, Matthew Cook.
And I'm your co-host, Ian Highfield. And to get started, I just want to say that we love golf and we love helping people. That combined has driven us to create this podcast. There's so much good information out there. We genuinely believe it's our responsibility to share that with as many people as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Matthew to introduce today's guest. As I know, Matthew, you guys have worked closely together, and he's a mentor of yours. So off you go.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Tim Lee, motor learning expert. How's it going, Tim?
Doing well, Matt. How you doing, Ian?
Good, I'm great. Thanks for coming on, Tim.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time and energy, Tim. Means a lot. Thanks for coming on.
Nice to be here.
All right, so today we are going to be talking about constraints-based learning and self-organization. Tim, what are your initial thoughts on the subject? Let's get straight into it.
Well, it's constraints-based learning and self-organization theory has been around since about the it's been around for a long time, but it's been used in the motor learning and motor control literature as a explanatory mechanism to understand complex movement control since about the early 1980s. And it came into prominence in the motor skills literature as a kind of a backlash or alternative, if you will, to motor program theory and schema theory in particular.
Awesome. So, Tim, just for the listeners that are tuning in, and probably for myself, can you just give us a little, I'm not going to pretend. Can you give us a little bit more information on motor learning, schema theory, just at a real baseline level, and then how that compares to constraints-led learning? I think that would be a great start for especially the golf coaches that are listening, that hear these words, that might not quite know the finer details.
Sure. Well, schema theory and motor program theory has been around for since about the early 1960s. The idea is that you learn to represent movement with a mental template, if you will, in the brain. A neural organization that when recalled or called up from memory is responsible for controlling the actions that are produced. So a motor program is basically a neural organization that controls the basic details of the outflow of movement. That was popularized in the early 60s and changed a little bit by Dick Schmidt in his schema theory paper in 1975, which says that basically you have not separate motor programs for everything we do, but generalized motor programs that are responsible for controlling a class of actions. And a good example is the golf swing. You don't have a separate motor program for every single swing that you have out on the golf course, but rather you might have one or two motor programs that are generalized to control all the different types of swings that you have. And so that's basically the idea, and it's a top-down approach to motor control, if you will. Top-down meaning the initiation of movement starts at literally the top of the body at the brain and flows outward towards the extremities. That's basically kind of a baseline idea about what top-down approach is. The constraints-based or emergent view of motor control is more of a bottom-up type of view, in that rather than the brain telling the muscles what to do, basically the environment and the body informs the brain what is being done. And as a result, movement is more of an emergent process that the brain comes to recognize rather than the brain controlling, if you will.
Yeah, awesome.
I've never had it explained to me like that.
No,
top down and bottom up sort of thinking.
I've done a lot of reading on this, and the way my brain works, obviously being a coach, I'm trying to adapt it to real life situations. So you can help me here, Tim. I was thinking of, if you think of schema theory and then the adaptation of a generalized motor pattern for the golf coaches and players that are listening, a good example of that might be Bubba Watson's shot when in the playoff in the Masters, when he hooks it round the tree, or Tiger Woods when he hit the bunker shot in the British Open and he's kneeling down and he's clubs in the bunker, but he's on his knees outside of the bunker. He has a general motor pattern there, and he's adapting that to the environment based on representations he has in his mind. Would that be a good way to actually apply it to specific examples that have happened in golf?
Sure, that's a great example. The idea of Bubba Watson hitting that 50-yard hook on the 10th hole of the playoff at the Masters is that he's using a generalized motor program, and the concept of a generalized motor program is that there are some things that don't change about the swing. And those are what Schmidt called the invariant characteristics of the swing. So he would still have the same timing with the swing, the same kind of speed of his backswing versus the downswing, maybe 1/3, 2/3 type thing. He might have the same, relative swing path, if you will, maybe a little bit of tweak, but it's not going to change dramatically. What he does to make the ball go in a different direction is tweak it a little bit, but the overall swing pattern is basically the same. So the generalized motor program idea is that you're not creating something absolutely new, but on the other hand, you're not calling up something that's completely old either. So he's using a generalized script, if you will, and then tweaking it for the requirements of that particular shot. Same with Tiger Woods. Even though he's on his knees and may have never practiced that shot before, the idea is that there's still going to be some general constraints. Oh, hang on, I don't want to use that word yet. There could be some general features of that movement that stay the same, even though he's on his knees and may have never hit that shot before. And those are the generalized aspects of that are characteristic of the motor program.
Awesome, really good. I know that from my experience, I'm a big believer in the schema theory, and I practically preach to players that, if you look at the best 125 players in the world that are on the PGA Tour, they're not the best golf swings. They have the ability to adapt a generalized pattern to the environmental demands of and I guess the psychological demands of the PGA Tour. So I'm a big believer in everything that you've just said, and that's one of the reasons why I love the way that Matthew coaches and love reading your guys' material.
Yeah, well, thanks, and I agree with you. I think that the motor program concept, generalized motor program concept, has a lot of merit to it. And if you looked at, you could even look at something as simple as a signature, writing your signature. If you were to do that 100 times and finally analyze not only the product, but also the neural mechanisms and machineries that go into producing that, what you would find is that over those 100 repetitions of the signature, no two of them are exactly the same. No two of them are produced exactly the same, and yet you still have a product that's going to look remarkably similar over 100 times. So again, the idea is that you don't store in the brain an exact template of what it is you're trying to do or what it is you're producing, but rather what you do is store a generalized concept that evolves into something a little bit different every time you do it. So trying to produce a golf swing the same every time, if you will, if you take that idea, trying to produce it every time exactly the same way is going to be kind of impossible to do.
You mean there's no such thing as getting the muscle memory?
Oh, he couldn't wait. He couldn't wait. I think he invited you on just so he could say this. Go on, say it again, Matthew.
You mean there's no such thing as muscle memory?
No.
That's no. It's interesting. You how you phrased it and how you just said it, Tim, I think is great for not only us but all of the listeners.
Yeah, and let me take that analogy one step further about the handwriting. The interesting thing is that even though you did it 100 times, you never did it exactly the same way twice. There are some commonalities to it, and this is kind of interesting. If you, and this has been shown a number of different times, but if you take your signature, for example, and do it with your dominant hand and write your signature, and then take your non-dominant hand and write your signature with your non-dominant hand, it's going to look differently, but there's also going to be a number of similarities there. And those similarities kind of represent the generalized aspect of the motor program, if you will.
Awesome. A great analogy. Can I try and take it one step further? This could be an epic fail, so we might have to cut this out of the podcast. If I now sign 100 times on a piece of paper in front of me, and then Matthew says, okay, there's a chalkboard up on the wall over there, but you're going to have to stand on a chair with a wobbly leg and use chalk to sign on this chalkboard. How is that more of an example of, okay, that's what Bubba Watson and Tiger Woods were doing when they got these complex shots? They're still accessing their generalized motor pattern, just in a more challenging environment. And if I have to go and sign that now and I fall off the chair, in effect, I failed to hit that 50-yard hook. If I succeed, it's kind of like what Bubba did in the Masters. Is that a good analogy? Because I've used it before.
He's trying to figure out if his coaching works.
Yeah, we could change my coaching here.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the signature that you produce on that chalkboard, it's going to have a lot of features that are very, very similar to your signature on that piece of paper. And those, I think, are the commonalities that represent the underlying motor program. So
we're not trying to get our students and get golfers to try and make the same swing twice. But that's not really what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop practices, create practices, and help golfers develop this ability to adapt to different environments using what we just talked about now. There's no real such thing as the exact same swing over and over.
Right. Well, so what Schmidt found was that there are some things about movement that are repeatable. And one of the things that he suggested was part of the generalized motor program is what he called relative timing. And it's kind of, if you think about the golf swing, you think about the different parts of the golf swing and the time it takes to achieve those. You can speed up and slow those down without actually changing the relative timing. So you can make a swing very quick or you make it very slow, but the relative timing is going to stay the same. And he uses something called a phonograph record analogy. That is, you know the old phonograph records that had the selector switch. You could move the speed of the turntable to 33 to 45 to 78 RPM. That doesn't change what's embedded in the record. It only changes what you hear coming out of the speakers. The idea is that you can speed up the record or slow it down. It's not going to change the relative timing of the music that's embedded in the record, only the tempo at which you hear it. I guess for golf, the idea would be to, in terms of relative timing, what's more important would be to work on the relative timing of the swing rather than the actual physical aspects of it.
Wow.
In terms of building up a generalized representation.
Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Tim is an incredible guest, lots to learn, but we're going to take a break because now it's time for Game of the Week. And today's game, based on the theme of the podcast, motor learning, is all about problem solving. So it has 2 levels. Level 1, 3 golf balls. You have to hit ball number 1 in the toe of the club, ball number 2 in the center, and ball number 3 in the heel. If you fail at any point, you must restart the level. If you're successful at executing all those 3 shots in a row, then the next problem you have to solve is you're going to hit 3 more golf balls. All of these have to hit the center of the face, but you're going to do it of varying tee heights. So this is a problem-solving game where you have to figure out how you hit the ball either in the center of the face from differing tee heights or in different parts of the club. That's really going to help you learn about your golf swing and your movements. So enjoy this game, enjoy challenging yourself and problem solving, and don't forget, if you're a coach who wants to take their coaching to the next level, check out Matthew's motor learning course. Now, back to the podcast.
So I've had good results like this, and I know you've had good results doing this, Ian. When we work with golfers who we might see flaws in their mechanics and their technique, we might find that the body's in positions and their club's in positions that are not going to be helpful or very influential to delivering the right impact characteristics to hit the ball how they want to do it. But if we've worked initially on the likes of rhythm, tempo, and timing, and seen huge improvements in their performance there and then without changing anything else but those things.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that, like speed variability testing. So getting students to swing it at different speeds and working through from slower to faster, and really almost finding a point where they don't access the motor pattern that you're trying to evolve, and then going and getting them playing at that speed. And generally, like Matthew said, just educating them and challenging them to make different speed swings and work with different tempos and finding what works for them. Would you say that's good coaching practice?
I think it is. Now you're getting into more of a constraints-based type of
I wish I did that on purpose. I was so close to just telling a lie and saying, you know what, I know.
No, it's and the constraints-based idea, I think, has some commonalities with things that are called differently, have different names used in research in the past, and basically I like to think of it as a problem-solving process. What you're doing is creating situations that requires the student, the individual, your student to problem solve the best way to make the swing, and you can do that by introducing various constraints, and the constraints are what the individual has to. The constraints produce something that the individual has to problem solve.
Yeah. So,
and I think that's a great way of coaching, because it puts the onus on the student to come up with the solution, rather than the onus being on the coach or instructor to try and impart that information to the student.
Yeah, I think, would you agree with this, Tim? Like, by doing that, presenting this situation that requires a student to actively discover, problem solve, how to go about achieving the goal or the task, whatever they're faced, and then whether they can do it or not is kind of irrelevant to some degree, because after the fact you have such a great opportunity to then deliver the coaching, deliver the message, or to then open the student's eyes to, you know what, this is how you could have done that to achieve that goal. And then all of a sudden the learning, would you say that the learning is enhanced quite significantly that way?
I think it's a great way of doing it, and for exactly the reasons that you suggest. I think it opens up the individual to understanding what they can do, what they can't do, what they understand and what they don't understand, and opening up the individual to that knowledge now, I think, makes the impact of the instructor or coach that much more effective. I think it's I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it really, I like that analogy, opening up, because I think it really frees the individual to be more receptive to information. And I'll give you, there's some really interesting research that's being done in cognitive psychology right now, what's called the pre-testing effect. So let me give you an analogy. Let's say I ask you something about which you know absolutely nothing.
Let's say many things that you could ask me about. Golf.
Let's say I ask you something about black holes. Something in astrophysics. And I say, okay, tell me what you know, or I'll ask you something specific about black holes. And you don't really know the answer, but you come up with something. Okay. And now I say, well, you know what, this part of what you said is right, but this part is wrong, and here, this is why it's wrong. That, having first tried to answer the question, makes you now much more receptive, as you said, opened up to that information I've just given you. Turn that around, and having just give you that information to start with is not going to be as effective, because you haven't really tried to think about it on your own first. And I think that's a great analogy to what you're talking about with the golf swing. Trying that information, trying it out on their own, makes a person much more receptive to information that's given to them by the coach and instructor afterwards than if they were to try and do that first. And you can extend that idea not just to verbal instruction, but you could also think about it in terms of observation, modeling, watching video. All those things, I think, are more effective after a person has tried to do it, rather than giving it to them first, which is kind of the textbook way of doing things.
That's exciting for me to hear. And I read some research on this. I don't know if it's schools in Scandinavia that are doing this, but I work with Penn State, and I actually give them the homework before the lecture. So they get the homework. They almost get the cliff notes. They go through the notes and try and answer my quiz, the questions, and then we have the lecture. And I did that based on, I think it was schooling in Sweden, and just some other research I read. But I've seen the interaction in class go up, and I've seen I can't measure the retention of the knowledge, but just their enthusiasm and drive in the classroom sessions is completely different than if I was just going to deliver them information for an hour.
Exactly. I think that's great. It really is a way of encouraging the individual to seek information, to problem solve information, rather than having that information provided for them.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I think it's not only a better way of learning, but it's one that sticks longer too. It's going to be retained longer, and probably because it's much more effortful on behalf of the individual, and they have to work at it. And it's getting people to work at things that's oftentimes a challenge I'm sure that you guys are faced with.
That is the challenge,
Yeah,
I'm afraid. That is the
Absolutely.
challenge. But I see it as teaching and telling. If you're just, if a student comes to you and you video the swing, you put them on all this technology, and then you just tell them what to do, how to do it, and you just literally are just reeling off words, and you're telling the student, you're not actually teaching them. So I've used that phrase quite often, teaching versus telling. I think that, teaching is what we've just talked about, and telling is the complete opposite. But Tim, do you have any examples of a constraints-based task, or do you have a golf example that you could share with us? Or could you think of one?
Sure. Even the idea of constraints is that there are different types of constraints that you can create. An individual brings their own constraints to the situation, and there are a lot of environmental constraints. One has to do with the golf club, the grip, for example. What ways does the grip change? The grip that the person holds. What ways does the way they hold the club change as a function of the grip itself? You've probably seen students that come to your classes with worn grips. What change happens with the student when you give them new grips compared to the old worn grips that they might have brought to the first class. What you see is that's a constraint. The way the individual is interacting with the club changes as a function of the grip itself. You could go to putting on 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. Bubba uses 13 wraps underneath his grip to build up the size of it. What changes in the swing are produced by just simple changes in the grip size. There's a self-organization theory. One of the concepts in self-organization theory is called the butterfly effect. Have you heard of that?
No.
The butterfly effect. It's an old idea from the early 1960s about weather patterns, and that is that a butterfly that flaps its wings in South Texas can have an impact on the weather in Europe. The idea being that very small changes can have global complex changes elsewhere. And the point here is that maybe just a very small tweak of the grip or the grip size can have huge changes in the swing itself. Okay, so there's an example of a change in the environment that can have a huge impact on the coordination pattern of a golf swing, potentially.
Awesome. I've done a lot of reading on this stuff, and I've looked at, Gibson's work and affordances, and I've looked at the dynamic systems theories and all of that. Sometimes for me, it gets a little bit extreme, and like we discussed before, kind of gets in a little bit of contention with the stuff we talked about earlier. For me, I believe that everything that we've talked about has a time and a place, and it's really about when you apply it into a training program. So what you've just said about the constraints of the grip, or maybe, we use constraint training more in the teaching games for understanding framework.
Right.
When would you look at maybe being more of an instructor and helping someone with their motion versus when would you look at putting them in a constraints game or changing constraints to try and change the swing? How are the coaches that are listening to this going to know, okay, this is my angle of attack because it's this time period? Do you have any advice from a research standpoint?
I can't really I can't really think of anything from a research point of view. I can only think of things from a practical point of view. We talked a few minutes ago about engaging the learner effortfully in practice. And I think that some of these things are ways that you can use to keep an individual maximally energized, if you will, through a practice session. If you can come up with constraints that require them to think differently, if you can come up with games that require them to be creative, and do that in a way that maximizes an individual's energy level through practice, I think you're going to probably be successful that way, or that should help to be successful. So you asked how to do that. I think trying to get inside the person's head to understand when they're starting to go through the motions would be a good point at which to switch things up.
Awesome answer. So
if you can do that, it
comes back to knowing your student and then actually helping that student create the motivation to learn. Because if they're not motivated, it's irrelevant anyway what you're going to do.
Yeah, I think so. And motivated, and also effortfully trying to figure things out in a problem-solving way. And doing that, coming up with creative games, coming up with constraints that require them really to figure it out for themselves, is a different way for the coach and instructor to affect learning. But it's not easy either. I mean, coming up with innovative ways to create constraints in games is difficult for, I think, an instructor. It's to do it in a meaningful way that's going to produce good learning. I think requires a lot of skill on behalf of the instructor and a lot of imagination.
Maybe we should start a company called Game Like Training.
I think our name resembles that quite well. Oh, that's good. I see it as, having a student really engaged and finding a way for them to be motivated really opens the door for you to really use these strategies and ways of enhancing learning. I think that's fantastic. Well,
yeah, and it's I understand that sometimes you practice on your own, and sometimes you might be practicing with a friend or two friends, and I think there are different games and constraints that you can create depending upon whether you're working with an individual on their own or in a small group. And again, I think the challenge is now for the coach or instructor to really come up with innovative ways to challenge their pupil to problem solve.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
Well, we're going to wrap it up. We're running out of time.
Whoa, not yet. And we got one more thing to cover.
What's that?
Because people will maybe view Tim as an academic. So sometimes there's this thing in the golf world that, these guys need to be able to play. So just before we go, when you played Orange County National, what did you shoot?
Oh my!
What did you shoot? 74? Tim, what did you shoot?
I think I was 71.
Oh, awesome. So for those people that have the objection of not maybe, it's just academic research and science has no place in golf, Tim's an under par shooter, by the way. So just wanted to put that one out there. And Matthew's an over par shooter. Okay. I've been waiting for that. Off you go, Matthew. Wrap it up.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate that. Although I'm just going to let everyone know I almost made albatross on the first hole. But all right, this was an incredible episode. I'm excited to get this one out there. I think it's going to be pretty badass. To keep up to date with us, you can subscribe to our mailing list on gltgolf.com/podcast radio show. You can follow us on SoundCloud or just like some of our social channels, Twitter @GLT Golf, Facebook, Game Like Training Golf, or Instagram at GL Training Golf. Everything we publish gets put out in some way, shape, or form on all of them platforms. And you can also check us out on YouTube, where you can watch the show. I'm not going to lie to you, we have a face for the radio. Well, Ian has a face for the radio, so yeah, you can check that out. If not, we will catch you next time. Thanks for listening.